Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we're jumping right into an absolutely massive topic. Our goal is to completely demystify the timeline, the major phases, and the huge global stakes of the Russo-Ukrainian war. This is an incredibly complex, ongoing conflict, and it has absolutely dominated global headlines. It's reshaping international security, it's impacting the global economy, and honestly, it affects all of us. So by breaking down the historical background and looking at the hard data, we're going to see exactly how a localized crisis exploded into a full-scale global flashpoint. Let's dive in. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with the origins of the conflict, move into the root causes, cover the 2022 full-scale invasion, and then unpack the humanitarian crisis and the global economic impacts. Starting off with Section 1, Origins of the Conflict, covering the years 2014 to 2021. Okay, let's rewind a bit and walk through this initial timeline because the seeds of the current war were planted a while ago. In early 2014, the Euromaidan protest in Ukraine culminated in the Revolution of Dignity. This actually led to the pro-Russian president Viktor Yanukovych fleeing the country. And almost immediately after that, unmarked Russian troops entered Crimea, which resulted in Russia annexing the peninsula in March following a widely disputed referendum. By April of that same year, Russian-backed militants had seized towns in Ukraine's eastern Donbas region. Now, they did sign the Minsk II agreements in February 2015 to try and establish a ceasefire, but, well, they were never fully implemented. Because of that failed ceasefire, the ensuing Donbas war essentially froze right into place. This is a really crucial point to understand. Despite the diplomatic agreements on paper, the fighting became a completely static conflict. Historians and analysts often compare it to trench warfare. Ceasefires were repeatedly broken, sure, but the actual front lines, they barely moved an inch for years. It was this simmering, highly localized conflict in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, but it was absolutely setting the stage for something much, much larger. That brings us to Section 2, Root Causes and Geopolitics. So why did this all escalate? If we want to look objectively at the geopolitical friction, political scientist Paul Dyasia breaks down the core motives from the Russian perspective into four main drivers. First up is the desire to regain control of Ukraine and install a friendly puppet regime. Second is this broader historical belief in a Russian sphere of influence over former Soviet republics, a sort of great power entitlement. Third is a deep-seated security dilemma, specifically fears regarding the expansion of NATO into Eastern Europe. And finally, number 4, the perception that a democratic, Western-leaning Ukraine poses a direct political threat to the governmental structure within Russia itself. These 4 pillars really form the foundation of the geopolitical breakdown we're seeing. And all of that geopolitical friction, it materialized in a huge way in 2021. Throughout that entire year, there was a massive Russian military buildup near Ukraine's borders, and that included forces stationed in neighboring Belarus. During this whole prelude, Russia was repeatedly denying any plans to attack, but simultaneously issuing these hardline demands that Ukraine be permanently barred from ever joining the NATO alliance. The diplomatic temperature was literally reaching a boiling point. Which leads us to Section 3, the 2022 full-scale invasion. When the escalation finally happened in early 2022, the sheer scale of the initial assault was just staggering. We are talking lightning-fast attacks launched across 3 completely distinct fronts, all at the exact same time. On the northern front, forces pushed down from Belarus, targeting the capital city of Kyiv directly. Meanwhile, on the southern front, troops advanced out of Crimea, aiming for key coastal cities like Mariupol and Kherson. And over on the southeastern front, they pushed from those already contested Luhansk and Donetsk regions straight toward Kharkiv. It was a massive, multi-directional strategy clearly intended to overwhelm Ukrainian defenses instantly. But as we now know, the reality on the ground shifted incredibly fast. By spring of 2022, facing incredibly stiff Ukrainian resistance, the Russian advance in the north completely stalled out. This actually led to a full retreat from the Kyiv area as forces had to be redeployed out east. Then, by the summer, the dynamics changed again. Ukraine launched a highly successful counteroffensive near Kharkiv, driving Russian forces back. But on the flip side, in the south, the city of Mariupol finally fell to Russian troops after a truly devastating and prolonged siege. So, very quickly, the war transformed from this planned lightning strike into a grinding, highly destructive, drawn-out conflict. Let's shift our focus to Section 4, the humanitarian crisis. 7,405,590. I just want to take a moment to let that staggering number sink in. By September of 2022, which was just months into the full-scale invasion, this was the number of refugees displaced across Europe fleeing for their lives. To really give that number the historical weight it deserves, the United Nations described it with one simple, powerful phrase:
the fastest-growing such crisis since World War II. It is a sobering reminder of the unprecedented speed and the sheer scale at which everyday civilian lives were just completely upended, which, of course, triggered a massive international humanitarian response.
And the human cost goes way beyond just displacement, right? Documented human rights violations have been a grim, persistent reality. Even before the 2022 invasion, between 2014 and 2021 alone, there were over 3,000 civilian casualties in the Donbass region. On top of that, the UN and various human rights organizations have consistently reported things like impeded rights of movement, arbitrary detentions in the conflict zones, and, especially after the 2022 escalation, the heavy bombardment of civilian targets and infrastructure located far, far away from the actual front lines. Moving on to Section 5, Global Economic Impacts. Actually, let's jump back to 2014 for just a second to look at the money, because the economic effects started instantly during the initial intervention in Crimea. Global markets reacted without hesitation. The Russian stock market tumbled by over 10%, and the ruble hit all-time lows against the US dollar and the euro. To try and stabilize their currency, Russia's central bank had to aggressively hike interest rates. This is when the international community first started introducing economic sanctions, essentially setting the precedent for the massive financial warfare we're seeing today. And the ripple effect of this conflict, it is truly global. For example, Ukraine is known as a major agricultural exporter for the world, right? So the threat to its stability caused an immediate massive surge in worldwide wheat and grain prices. Meanwhile, over on the currency markets, investors were panicking and fleeing to safety. The euro and the US dollar rose, and the Swiss franc, which is your classic safe haven currency, climbed to a 2-year high against the dollar. It really highlights how incredibly sensitive the global economy is to this specific instability.
Now, this is where it gets really fascinating from a geoeconomic perspective. Think about the European Union's massive green transition away from fossil fuels. This transition directly threatens Russia's traditional fossil fuel-dependent business model. But at the exact same time, look at Ukraine's natural resources. Out of the 30 raw materials that the EU classifies as strategically critical for this green transition, 22 of them are located in large quantities right inside Ukraine. So controlling this territory isn't just about drawing political borders. It's about controlling the very raw materials that are going to power the global economy for the next century.
Which leaves us with this final, profound question to think about today. With global supply chains totally disrupted, millions of innocent people displaced, and major world powers pouring in military and economic support, will this conflict permanently reshape the global energy transition and the entire architecture of international security? Looking at the facts, it's clear the Russo-Ukrainian war is way more than just a regional dispute. It's a massive turning point in modern history. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this structured look at the historical phases and the global stakes has given you a much clearer understanding of the forces at play here.